Welcome to Elemental Energy, the podcast where we discuss how to simplify decarbonization. Here, we will introduce emerging low-carbon energy technologies and give you insight on how to navigate and support the evolving energy landscape. It is our goal to develop content to give you confidence to help transition the market and make low-carbon energy reliable and affordable. I'm your host, Marcia Leonard. So, everybody who is returning to Elemental Energy, thank you very much for joining us. And if you are new to Elemental Energy, welcome. But for everybody here today, I have an exceptional treat. Today, we're going to be talking about the law of power density and why it's really important to understand this concept if you are in the energy industry. And today I am joined by a renowned author and journalist. His pieces have graced the surfaces of New York Times and Wall Street Journal. He has spent 3 decades in the energy industry with a focus on energy and politics. And most impactfully, he is the executive producer of the documentary Juice: How Electricity Explains the World. And the reason I say the most impactful is because I watched this documentary when I was at a very pivotal moment in my career, when I was about to transition out of oil and gas into power generation. And it really affirmed my direction going into electrification was the right steps. And it's not only been impactful to me, but it has been impactful to everybody who I've actually shared this documentary with. So to say I'm a little bit excited about our guest today might be a bit of an understatement. And without further introductions, Robert Bryce, welcome to Elemental Energy.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you, Marcia. Happy to be with you.
Well, Robert, I was going to ask you to introduce yourself about, your typical energy background and stuff, but anybody can Google your name, Robert
Sure.
Bryce, and see what your background and profile is. So I want you to introduce yourself in a little bit more personal of a manner. Are you a cat or dog person? What do you do for fun? Does something super gross you out? Give us
No. Okay, sure. So, well, first things first. I'm a proud father. I've got 3 incredible kids, Mary, Michael, and Jacob. Michael got married a couple weeks ago in Denver, and my kids are great. They're all out of the house. Well, Lauren, my wife, and I have been married for 37 years. So those 4 people are the most important things in my life, and super proud of all of them. My wife, Lauren, is a teacher, a potter, and a photographer. She's teaching ceramics right now at Laguna Gloria here in Austin. So super proud of my family. That's the center of my life. I also write and talk about the energy and power sectors and have for a long time. I'm a dog person, by the way. Cats E. I don't like cats. I'm the author of 6 books. The latest one is A Question of Power, Electricity, and the Wealth of Nations. It's now out in paperback. The paperback came out. There it is. There's the paperback. Came out in May with a new preface, and I write exclusively now on Substack. So if I was going to promote anything besides my books, my podcast, my upcoming film, which I hope we can talk about, follow me on Substack, robertbryce.substack.com.
Now, Robert, this is where we're gonna start wading into the articles that you posted on Substack, which is why you and I connected. But I want to start out. I ask everybody a very polarizing question. And you have one of the most interesting responses on your outlook of climate change. Will you please share your outlook on climate change?
Sure. My view on climate change is very simple. Climate change is a concern. It's not our only concern. We have to balance whatever action we take on climate change, whether it's mitigation, adaptation, whatever, against all the other needs in our society. So we have to be very careful and very focused on what we are doing in response to this challenge. I've been very consistent for now 13 years, more than 13 years. Natural gas and nuclear. If we're serious about decarbonizing the electric sector, we're serious about decarbonization in general, those are the ways forward. Renewables are, there are a lot of people who support renewables. I have solar panels on the roof of my house. Renewables can't do it. We're already seeing the limits on renewables and the problems that wind and solar are causing on our electric grid. So we have to be very careful when we think about how our response to climate change. And if we want to see how ruinous policy can be, we only need to look at Europe and more specifically, Germany in particular. And here in the United States, we can look at California, which, like Germany, is driving itself straight into the ditch because of ruinously expensive and I would argue disastrous climate policies.
So another podcast I had listened to of yours, other than the Power Hungry podcast, you talked about how this climate change movement is almost becoming like a religious, like kind of zealot as well. Can you expand on that concept a little bit for me?
Sure. I'm not the first to observe this, but there are many parallels and overlaps between Christian theology and ideas around redemption and sin and even indulgences between the climate change discussion and traditional Christian thought. I mean, I fly a lot. I'm flying to Jackson, Mississippi tomorrow for a speaking engagement to a co-op, an electric co-op there. And I could, after I bought my airline ticket, buy a carbon credit. Well, Martin Luther would recognize carbon credits. This is an indulgence, right? Oh, somehow we're going to wipe out all these CO2 molecules that I'm going to be emitting because I'm flying. Well, this was the cause of the Reformation, the corruption of the church on this idea you can sin and somehow get a get out of jail free card. A carbon credit is a get out of jail free card. It's just a modern one. So the other parallels are obvious, that we've sinned. We're living too well. We need to go back to the garden. We need to revert to a more simple time where we just rely on natural forces, the wind and the sun. And of course, then the ultimate technology, ultimate biting of the apple is nuclear energy. Oh, we can't use that because it's too dangerous. So there are many parallels here between how I would say the climatism overlaps with Christianity and more traditional ideas of Judeo-Christian thought around how we view ourselves on the planet and our place on it. So there's just no doubt that is part of the reason for the strength of this dogmatic, almost religious belief in among some people in this catastrophic narrative. So not denying, that we may face climate change, we may be facing serious changes, but we have to be serious too about how we respond, so we don't wreck our economy and drive the poor and the middle class into the ground in our response.
I think that's one of the ways that I can tell that you spent 3 decades in this industry, to have been exposed to that kind of perspective, because that's really deep to associate it down to that level, in my opinion. I mean, I'm just thinking science. I mean, we're literally having an impact. We can measure our CO2 output, but that's a very deep one.
Well, thanks. And to be clear, I've never had a real job. I've been a reporter my whole career. I've never been in the energy sector. So I'm not an engineer, don't claim to be. I don't have any more technical knowledge except what I've learned on my own. So I view myself as a reporter. That's who I am. That's what I do.
Yeah, that's a really good clarification. So we were talking about deep. Let's wade into the Substack article that led me to reach out to you.
Sure.
The law of power density. Explain that for us, please.
Sure. Well, this concept, I stole. Amateurs borrow, professionals steal, which is a line that's very variously attributed to Picasso and John Lennon. But I stole this idea of the iron law of power density from my friend Roger Pilkey Jr. Roger coined the iron law of climate policy, which says that when forced to choose between economic growth and action on climate, policymakers will choose economic growth every time. Okay, so I stole this idea of the iron law and I applied it to power density. So let me be clear about what is power density. And I know this from long experience in speaking to a lot of audiences. I'm going to do 35 or 40 speaking engagements this year. Even in the energy sectors, people don't understand the difference between energy and power. They are not the same thing. Energy is the ability to do work. Power is the rate at which work gets done. We don't care about energy. What we want is power. So I don't, to make an analogy that I've made many times, I'd gladly put sawdust or peanut butter or cornflakes into the fuel tank of my truck if I thought when I pressed the accelerator, it would give me the motive power that I want. I don't really care what is coal or natural gas or uranium that's fueling this light in front of me. What I want is the lighting power. I want magnification power, computing power. Okay, so we care about power. But we care about power density. Why? Because power density is a measure of energy flow that can be harnessed from a given area, volume, or mass. Now, again, this is a basic concept in physics, but not well understood by the general public. So we care about areal power density. More specifically, what is the footprint of our energy system? How big is it? One of the reasons why I'm a longtime critic of corn ethanol, it takes so much land. We're farming an area roughly the size of the state of Nebraska to produce corn ethanol for our gas tanks. This is an enormous footprint. The power density of corn ethanol is 1/10 of a watt per square meter. For wind energy, it's 1 watt per square meter. For solar energy, it's 10. For nuclear and natural gas, it's 2,000 or more watts per square meter. So small footprints are the environmental ideal. We want small footprints. We don't cover the world. We don't want to cover the world with wind turbines and solar panels. That's the antithesis of environmentalism. So the iron law of power density, back to the point here, it says the lower the power density, the higher the resource intensity. If you have a low power density source like corn ethanol, like wind, you have to counteract it with other inputs, steel, concrete, fertilizer, diesel fuel, whatever it is, copper, to make up for that low power density. Nuclear and natural gas have high power density, therefore they have low resource intensities. They don't require as much copper, as much steel, et cetera. So there are many reasons why we're seeing problems in the renewable sector. Inflation is one of them. High interest rates is another. But fundamentally, it's a loser when it comes to material intensity. And that's in the shortest way I can do it, Marcia, the shortest explanation for the iron law of power density.
It was an excellent explanation. And I want to point out the fact it's so simple when you say it that way. Like, it really is simple. If you think about, footprints, if you have a huge footprint and it's not producing a lot of energy, it doesn't make much sense. That it's so simple that people in our industry overlook it. Is that fair to say?
Oh, yes. And people in the energy industry, I mean, I speak to a lot of energy audiences, and I ask them, okay, who can here explain the difference between energy and power? Who can, very few. And so, but it's critical, and it's critical for people in the industry, and outside of the industry. This is basic physics. But I think one of the reasons why we talked about earlier, belief systems, and why this renewable mirage has gotten so much traction, well, I think a lot of that is due to the fact that even in the energy industry, but in the public at large, the general public is scientifically illiterate and innumerate. And if you're innumerate and you don't know the difference, difference between energy and power, between watts and BTUs or whatever, you'll believe anything because it sounds good. But we lack, as a society in general, a basic grounding in basic math and basic physics. And I'll use a line that it's a joke line, but it happens to be true. Who makes our energy policy? Well, it's lawyers. We're governed by a society they're headed by lawyers. Why are they all lawyers? Because they couldn't do the math to get into engineering school. So we don't have a lot of engineers in power. Why not? Because in our political office. Why? Well, they're working, and lawyers are the politicians.
Like it. Okay, Robert, I promise after I ask these other questions, we're going to talk a little bit more about metrics, but I want you to go in to explain how EROEI, or the EROEI,
energy return on energy invested,
how does it relate and confirm the law of power density?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they are related. If we talked about this, the resource intensity. Well, if you think about resource intensity, well, energy is a resource, right? So just as I was talking about corn ethanol and the fact that it requires a lot of inputs, the same is true when it comes to like ethanol, right? So if you're trying to produce ethanol, you're going to have to put a lot of energy into the system in order to get that corn ethanol out. So diesel fuel, fertilizer, et cetera. So in fact, when you think about energy return on energy invested, the graphics in many ways look very similar to what you see when you're talking about the iron law of power density. It's really just another way to think about inputs versus outputs. One is, the material and resource inputs, copper, steel, et cetera. The other is just, watts per unit of energy out. So biomass in general, is kind of break even. Photosynthesis, whether we're using hay or wood or whatever, it's roughly 1 unit in, 1 unit out. Wind and solar are slightly better than break even. Oil and gas at 10 to 100 watts better return. And nuclear is the winner, of course, where you get 100 times more energy out than the amount of energy that's put in. So these are usual metrics in thinking about, in physics, they're common metrics, but they are, again, not well understood by the general public.
So the reason I asked these two questions before is because can you explain LCOE, the levelized cost of energy? Because the EROIE and power density, those are like pre-metrics in my mind when you're trying to give people the conceptualization. But LCOE is a term that is commonly used in the power generation space, levelized cost of energy. What do you know about it? How can you explain that metric to us?
Well, that metric is kind of a bastard metric because it's not one that is a fully inclusive metric. And it's trotted out many times. In fact, I testified in front of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee almost 2 years ago, and Martin Heinrich, the senator from New Mexico, trotted out this big chart with the LCOE claiming, well, wind and solar are cheaper. Okay, well, yeah, maybe, but a Toyota Corolla is cheaper than a Ford Mustang or a Ford sedan, right? It's not, it's cheaper, but is it more valuable? So just because something is cheaper doesn't mean it's valuable, right? In terms of what its efficacy, its role in the system that we're talking about. So levelized cost of energy is usually trotted out by alternative energy promoters to say, well, look, this is the cheapest form of generation. Well, it's cheaper only if you don't count other costs, including the cost of transmission, including the cost of the backup, the energy sources that are going to be needed to offset the incurable intermittency of solar and wind. So LCOE, I think, is a discredited metric, and it should be discredited more because it is just simply not a fully inclusive way to think about how our energy and power systems work.
I'm really glad to hear that response because the reason I've asked about these three metrics is everyone who's a nuclear advocate, listen up, perk up, listen to this, is we don't have any way to measure new nuclear LCOE yet. It's just such a long shot to even be talking about what the levelized cost of energy looks like for nuclear. So the reason I was really excited to bring you in, Robert, is to introduce this law of power density and the EROEI is because when it comes down to supporting nuclear and being an advocate for it, we need to talk about these pre-metrics. And even though there's such a simple concept, bringing that up to leadership in order to help them understand it, as you heard from Robert, is not a lot of people grasp this concept. So it's really important that we have this in our back pocket to promote and advocate for nuclear. Is that safe to say?
Yes, it is. And again, this is one of the challenges that we face in terms of trying to make things simple, right? Or simpler for the general public, right? We can make them simple, but only to a certain level, right? We can't, there's an old line, a friend of mine used to cover the Texas legislature, and he remembered this one exchange between some guy who was testifying and a politician who kept asking him questions. And he said, "No, politician, well, can you explain it one more time to me? What you're talking about here?" And finally, the guy who was testifying said, was frustrated and said, "Well, listen, Senator, I can explain it to you, but I can't understand it for you." So, we can make this as simple as we can, but I think this whole brand around and the ideas around levelized cost of energy are largely misplaced, right? We're putting too much faith in this one metric, and it's been popularized by Lazard, I think, has been one of the ones that's been promoting it more heavily than anyone else. Well, that's fine, but it doesn't give us a full picture about what different forms of energy and power generation, what they provide to the system. And that's critical because we need baseload. We need systems. We need power generation that has baseload characteristics that can assure the grid inertia to assure that the grid doesn't fail. And these forms of weather-dependent generation are adding chaos to the system. And the last thing we want in our most important energy network is chaos.
So the title of this podcast, Elemental Energy, Simplifying Decarbonization. It is really important to talk about these things because you just said it perfectly, that chaos that we are adding to our power network system. You think about these smart grids that we're trying to include. You think about these distributed energy systems. I mean, why are we complicating things when there is a more direct answer through the support of nuclear, is how I see this concept.
Well, how long is our podcast today, Marcia? How long do we have?
We have time. Lay it on us. That's why you are here. Is I want to ask you these questions because I want to know this information.
Sure. Well, so my most recent piece on Substack, robertbryce.substack.com, is called Nuclear Now, with a question mark on the end. Nuclear Now. And I've been pro-nuclear. I've had the same stance on nuclear energy for 13, 14, 15 years. Well, and my view is simple. If we're serious about reducing CO2 emissions, we have to get very serious about nuclear, full stop. And the top climate scientists in the world agree with this. So does the International Energy Agency. Anyone who's serious about these issues recognizes the importance of nuclear power. But let's be clear as well and very sober about the challenge, because the challenges are enormous and the capital costs are enormous. And over the past, in my piece Nuclear Now, I published a graphic that I derived or used the numbers from the International Energy Agency from their World Energy Investment Report that just came out a few weeks ago. For now nearly a decade, global spending on wind and solar has been 10 times greater than the spending on nuclear. In the U.S., the allocations for nuclear in the Inflation Reduction Act are minimal compared to the amount of money being spent on renewables. We've let our domestic nuclear sector atrophy over the course of the last 2 decades. It's going to take time to get the momentum and the capital behind that industry to allow it to really grow. So in addition, there are many challenges, but the ones that I talk about, capital, fuel, and regulation. The second one is fuel. We haven't built any domestic uranium enrichment, new uranium or U.S.-owned uranium enrichment facilities in the United States since the 1950s. Centrus Energy is getting ready to start a new one in I think it's Piketon or Pikeville, Ohio. In the next few weeks, they're going to inaugurate a new facility. We used to be self-sufficient in uranium. Now we are almost wholly dependent on imports. Russia supplies almost half of the world's supply of enriched uranium. We got to fix that. And then finally, regulation, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is a mess. And the Democrats have renominated Jeff Barron, even though he's clearly not pro-nuclear. But the Democrats, and I say this I'm not a partisan, the Democratic Party has been reflexively anti-nuclear for 50 years. Now, is it changing somewhat? Yes. But President Biden has not said one positive thing about nuclear energy in his time in office. And if he's serious about climate change, and he says he is, why isn't he beating the drum on nuclear? Because I think he has a lot of people around him who are not pro-nuclear, and they're just saying, we're not going to talk about that. Even they've made some good things. They've done some good things on the nuclear front. I'm not denying that. But we need somebody on the bully pulpit to say, damn it, we got to get serious here. And we're ceding global leadership to the Chinese and the Russians. I think that's just a colossal error.
Maybe it's just because of who I'm following on LinkedIn, but I had seen a lot from the Department of Energy, and Jigar Shah was the one who was actually promoting these nuclear, funding and trying to bolster it. But I want to further collaborate with you, Robert, because I think there's a really interesting piece on where new nuclear is going to come into play, the utility space, as well as industrial application. And I think that industrial application is almost going to come faster in some senses than the utility space. Do you have any opinions on that?
Well, that may well be. And I think to bolster what you're saying is the deal that Dow has done with X Energy on the SMRs that they're hoping to deploy in Seadrift, Texas. Dow has a huge facility there, a plastics and chemicals refining facility there. They're planning to put 4 SMRs. I think total capacity is going to be over 300 megawatts, if memory serves. Maybe Dow is going to use all of that heat and industrial heat, process heat from the reactors and the electricity. Maybe they use that all on site and never connect to the ERCOT grid. I don't know that for a fact. But I think that these big industrials are looking out at the world and saying, we're the grid isn't as reliable as it used to be. We have a lot of volatility. They saw it particularly during Winter Storm Uri 2.5 years ago. And they're looking at the possibility of just simply seceding from the grid with these new reactor designs. But let's also be clear, X Energy needs fuel, and they need, in fact, X has pretty sure they're using triso fuel, so they need a even more specialized form of nuclear fuel that is derived from HALEU, high-assay low-enriched uranium, and we're not producing any of that. And the only country capable of producing HALEU right now is the Russians. So I'm adamantly pro-nuclear all day long. I will beat the drum on nuclear all day long, but we have to be very sober about what we're talking about and what the challenges are.
Okay, I love that. And I think it's a good segue. Yes, nuclear, you and I share that same mindset. We're very pro. Thank you for sobering me up a little bit more. I want to pull us to natural gas really quickly, because natural gas, I spent time in the conventional energy sector, like pipeline. I'm very aware of natural gas, what it is used for, the importance of it. And I believe that we should still continue to use it as well. But I'm really interested to hear your take on CCUS associated with it, the carbon capture, utilization, and storage component of natural gas.
Sure. So I'm pro gas as well, and have been. I've been beating the drum, the same thing. I'm one trick pony of the ultimate form. I've been talking about natural gas and nuclear end to end now for 13 or 14 years. If we're serious about decarbonization, natural gas to nuclear end to end. Preface before I get to CCS on nat gas. Well, why nat gas? Well, because it's the resources globally are staggeringly large, and there are massive deposits of stranded gas around the world, particularly in Africa and in the Eastern Mediterranean. The discoveries of gas in the Eastern Mediterranean offshore Israel, Gaza, Egypt, they're just enormous. Lebanon, the Israelis and the Lebanese, who are longtime enemies, are now going to develop a gas field together, which, I mean, put your mind around that. I've been to Beirut, I've been to Israel. The fact that they're going to cooperate on any kind of energy development is remarkable in and of itself. So gas resources globally are very large and should be developed, and they are being developed. And the U.S. is now the global gas superpower. We're going to be exporting more LNG to the global market than any other country in the world within about a year or two. CCS, however, again, I'm skeptical, and I wrote this in my book in 2010, Power Hungry, pointing out that the scale. Well, okay, so first, let's assume we have a power plant and it's 100 megawatts and it's gas-fired, and we want to strip out the CO2. Well, you have a parasitic load to get that CO2 out of the flue gas of 30%. So now your 100 megawatt power plant is now only producing 70 megawatts. Well, that's a huge cost. If you've now derated my plant by 30%, and it cost me, let's say, $100 million. Well, okay, so now I spent $100 million and I've got a $70 million output or got 70% of the output that I should have. Well, then now I have a gas that's colorless, odorless, and asphyxiant and heavier than air. And I want to put it into a pipeline and pump it down in the ground somewhere. Well, okay. So, and it's worthless.
Oh, no. Let's not forget, we'll sell those carbon credits too. We'll sell them.
And 45Q is igniting a lot of interest into CCUS. There's no doubt about it, under the Inflation Reduction Act. And those 45Q credits are incredibly lucrative, up to $135 a ton. So the potential for industrial companies or power producers to financialize those credits is just enormous. And I've heard tales about how quickly some of these new plants that use CCS can pay for themselves. But where are you going to put it? Now, in the Permian Basin in West Texas, which is actually CO2 short, where they can use it for the CO2 for secondary, tertiary recovery, I have no doubt they can utilize as much CO2 as they can find in that area. But in other parts of the country where there aren't wells, where there aren't fields where you can necessarily store that, there's going to be resistance, and there's going to be resistance on the pipelines. Remember, it was just a few days ago, maybe a couple of weeks ago, regulators in North Dakota rejected a CO2 pipeline application. So you think it's hard to build pipelines and transmission lines for things that carry something that's valuable. It's going to be even harder to carry something that's worthless and an asphyxiant and heavier than air. And you're going to pump it through my valley? Yeah, I don't think you might find some resistance to this. So let's be clear, very sober and clear-eyed about the challenges here. Yes, it's an interesting technology, but I've been hearing this story now for over a decade.
So let's take it up to a positive note, because
So I'm being a little too skeptical for you here, Marcia.
No, you're not being skeptical at all. Like, these are challenges that we have to keep in the forefront of our minds in order to
Yeah.
address them, because they are real in this energy transformation space. But I have to think positively about this, because
Sure.
being in the engineering industry, I see the feasibility studies related to all of these projects. And Robert, I am proud and a firm believer that the groundwork that my company does and other engineering firms is what is going to help some of these pipelines come to fruition and to achieve permitting and requirements, because everybody is putting a lot of money. I mean, let's be real. You and I are paying for it as taxpayers for CCUS,
Sure.
which is, we have to think future and be like, this is a solution if we can get it right to truly capturing carbon. It is a solution.
Yeah.
So
To some of the CO2, right? And if you have stationary sources, it could make a dent in the emissions from some of those stationary sources. I won't argue with that.
Robert, I want to talk to you all day. But I'm going to throw you kind of a one-off curveball. I didn't even
Go ahead.
mention this in the
Fire
agenda.
away. Give me your best stuff here.
I want to know your opinion on hydrogen, because, we talk about green fuels and
Sure.
green hydrogen particularly. I want to know your opinion.
The H in hydrogen stands for hype. Again, I'm all day skeptical. Yes, there are the 45V credits, if I'm remembering correctly, for hydrogen. The energy return on energy invested in hydrogen is negative. It's 3 to 2. It's 1.5 units in for 1 unit out. I mean, as my friend Steve Brick says, it's a thermodynamic obscenity. We're going to spend 1.5 joules of high quality energy, electricity, to produce 1 joule of hydrogen. Well, okay, then we have 1 joule of hydrogen, which, however many molecules are in 1 joule of hydrogen. Well, then we have a very small molecule that's hard to tank, hard to store, hard to transport, and then we're going to put it in a fuel cell. Well, I'm an old guy. I'm 63. I've seen 3 fuel cells in my entire lifetime. Where's that fuel cell you're going to put it into? Okay, you can put it into a recip engine, and there's no doubt there are recips now, including Wärtsilä, that are doing testing and have tested up to 20% hydrogen with nat gas in their recip engines, and that it can work. No doubt about it. But the front end losses on the hydrogen creation itself are enormous. So as I look at it, we have plenty of energy now, but to put a bunch of energy into something that is an energy carrier, not actually a source of energy, there are a lot of challenges. Will we see hydrogen projects built? Yes, of course, but only because of the tax credits.
Have you heard of gold or white hydrogen?
Never heard of that. There are so many colors of tutti frutti, striped, all colors of the rainbow hydrogen. I can't. Yeah, these are to me white and gold hydrogen. I've heard green, gray, blue,
Pink, turquoise, orange. I mean, it's all how it's derived.
My favorite is purple, but that's my favorite color is purple. I haven't heard purple hydrogen. So, but white and gold. Tell me about those.
Okay, so first I want to step into that nomenclature will soon be changing in the industry. We're going to actually be, announcing hydrogen with the weight of CO2 that's associated through the production. So the color scheme is going to be slowly drifting away. But I have a really interesting hope for white hydrogen, or gold hydrogen, which is also called, it's naturally occurring hydrogen. Like, they're actually finding hydrogen gas seeps under the surface.
Oh, okay.
And then there's also another company called Cemvita Gold H2, where they're taking previously drilled oil wells, which still have product within them, and they're dropping down extremophiles, bacteria, which go down, eat the oil, and produce hydrogen gas. So they're
cool. I'm all about extremophiles. I love me some extremophiles. I've heard Bob Ballard talk about them, and the weird worms and stuff that live near these deep sea thermal vents and stuff. I'm all about that. I think that's cool.
Isn't it amazing? So, like, I'm bringing us back up to, hydrogen. It's still in its infancy. And yes, it does take a lot of energy to produce it as it currently stands, but I have a lot of hope. I've also heard hydrogen be called hopium, which is,
Yes, right.
yeah. But I have a lot of hope for it because I see these other technologies that are starting to emerge, Robert. And I know that through this space, nuclear, natural gas, and I'm a firm believer in hydrogen as well, but it's how it's actually produced, which is going to be really important. Pink hydrogen from nuclear, there's another one, but I am thankful.
Yeah, we'll see. And hydrogen from nuclear. Okay, I can, maybe see that. So Synovita, Synovita.
Cemvita, Cemvita.
Oh, okay.
And I actually had their CEO, Charles Nelson, on my podcast. So if you want to get a little more knowledge about it, go check out I think it's episode 12 with Charles Nelson.
Oh, okay. Gold hydrogen. Okay. All right. Well, I can dig that. I love me some extremophiles. That's, but if it involves cracking water or, steam methane reforming, we're using that a lot, of course, to produce hydrogen now. But, don't talk about steam methane reforming. Okay, never mind. But anyway, so that's cool. That's one of the joys of my job. I get to learn about all these different technologies. But Zeta, I'll look at their website now.
We could talk about steam methane reforming, but that's a different conversation for a different day. So... Right. Everybody, I am so thankful that you listened in. I hope you learned a lot from Robert and myself, but most importantly, go check out Robert's podcast. The Power Hungry podcast is one of my favorites to tune in. Is it weekly, Robert? It's kind of sporadic.
Tuesday, we generally publish one a week. Sometimes we publish more than one per week, but Tuesdays is our publication day. The newest one is out now with Yonatan Dubey, who's a new friend of mine. He's a physics professor at the Ben Gurion University of the Negev. I'm remembering correctly here. He's a really interesting guy, and we talked for an hour on energy policy in Israel, what's going on in Israel, offshore gas with the nuclear sector. Very interesting guy, Yonatan, or he goes by his nickname Yoni. So that was a really fun. I love the podcast because I don't have any sponsors. I don't take any advertising. My only hurdle is this a person that I would want to talk to for an hour? Do I think they're interesting? And do I think other people would find them interesting? So it's my passion project. But, as you can tell, I like talking about this stuff. So, Yoni, and I'm almost at podcast number 200. I think that was podcast number 197, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, getting up there.
Amazing. So Power Hungry podcast. Substack. I really enjoy reading your articles. Thank you for publishing there. Multiple books, but if you take away anything from this podcast today, please go and watch Juice, How Electricity Explains the World. You could find it for free. If you have Roku, just search Juice, How Electricity Explains the World. It's on Amazon. It's on any kind of streaming platform, but please watch it because that really gave me a different perspective on electricity. And as I said, it's super impactful to truly see what I help deliver people out of poverty and bring light to their situation. And I mean that quite literally. So Robert, please close this out, sir.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Marcia. As you can tell, this is what I do. This is my passion and my purpose. I'm going to continue doing this. I don't plan on retiring. I can't retire. What am I going to do? I don't play golf. So I'm going to be doing this for the next 10 years. Follow me on Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. It's been a real pleasure. I'm going to follow up on this gold hydrogen thing. That sounds interesting.
All right, everybody. Stay happy. Most importantly, stay safe. And thank you for listening. Thank you all so much for listening today. If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe so you're notified every time a podcast is released. Find Elemental Energy on Facebook and connect with me, Marcia Leonard, on LinkedIn. But lastly, and most importantly, share this podcast with your family and your friends, especially if you are in the energy industry and you're having an influence on the path of decarbonization. I'm on this journey figuring things out, and I want you guys to come along. So the closer I can get to you and the more I can connect with you, the better this show will be and become.